Hi, my name is Jan Brugard. Together with Patrik Ekenberg, I will present Wolfram System Modeler in Education. It's based on some intern projects we had this summer, where interns worked developing material for education in System Modeler, and we will present different examples from that. So let's get started. My name is Jan Brugard, and I'm here to present together with Patrik Ekenberg over there. We're presenting a work on how to use System Modeler in education, and it's based on work that we had three interns at the office during this summer during some work. So it was Frida Svensson. She's a master student in applied physics and electrical engineering. It's Anna Palmer from Australia, who has a bachelor in biomedicine and just starting her master's. And then Emil Arkstål from Sweden that is studying biological engineering, a master's there too. So during this summer, we had them come to MathCore, our office in Linköping, and gave them a crash course of about 3 days in System Modeler. And then we basically gave them an open sheet where they could choose any topic they would like to. I thought, this is something I studied back at university that I thought was a little bit complicated to understand, or at high school that I thought was complicated to understand, and that could be improved by using models. So basically, well, Emil was at Wolfram MathCore last year, so he had some experience. The two others were completely new to the product. And now we're presenting a bit of what they've done, so you can see and get some kind of inspiration on how to use it. So the material that has been developed, to give a quick overview, is some material for primary and high schools, and some material for colleges and universities. The idea is to expand on this as we go. So if we start looking at primary and high schools, we have some material for physics, with examples like hitting a baseball, jumping on a trampoline, doing a bungee jump. I will use the bungee jump example to illustrate a bit how it's actually used, the ideas of how to use it for teaching. And then within life science, Anna Palmer developed models for population dynamics, studying things like the spread of malaria. And Patrik will show that later on. For colleges and universities, last year we presented this one, so a few of you probably saw that, where we're looking at classical mechanics and how to make that more understandable by user models. So we could basically make a model of a swing and simulate and understand more of it. There's also some exercises in computational biology. And I actually have no clue what this model is about, but one of the examples. Electrical engineering, we presented that last year, so it's not going to be presented this year. And finally, some on chemistry, and Patrik is going to present the chemistry part. So as you can see, it's material from a kind of wide range of applications that we have been working on together with our interns. And I will start with the physics. Okay, this was small. Let's do like that. Okay, so each of these materials we've been working on have 4 different pieces to it. There are teacher instructions, and we'll look at them soon, how they look like. So basically giving the background to the teacher about the example. There are the assignments to the students, with the model and appropriate questions for the student. The corresponding models to be used, as well as the solutions. So all these are developed for each of these, let's say, pieces of courseware. So let's look at the part here with physics, what Frida worked on during the summer. And the idea was to make examples that are playful and fun. So basically, she said that when she was studying back in high school, she had a lot of classmates that didn't like physics, they didn't like math, and for that reason, they didn't really get engaged and didn't learn too much. So she said, but if we could do that more, like come alive, then perhaps those kids would start to like and understand physics better. So that was her ambition with it. Making them be able to do rather complicated things without having to go into the tricky formulas behind the scenes. So things she took inspiration from 2 courses that she had been taking, Physics 1 to 3 from the Swedish upper secondary school, and also engineering mechanics that she had been taking at the university. So these 2 were kind of basic input for her there. And then she used some books, which we also refer to in the material as background, so they actually relate to what you are teaching in the specific courses. Okay, so she worked with 4 different examples. 1 bungee jump. I will go into this soon, so I'm not talking more to you, but then a bit about trains, 1 on trampoline, and 1 on baseball. So if we look at the 1 on baseball, the type of questions you try to answer is, are there any baseball fans here? I guess there is. Anyone? Yeah, 1, 2, 3, some. If I would ask in Sweden, nobody would. Sorry. So apparently there's someone called Yogi Berra, kind of known. And he said, you can't think and hit at the same time. It goes too fast. So the ambition when Frida developed this was, well, what if we could do this so you can kind of hit it and think at the same time? Because if you simulate, you can pause it, and you can kind of see and study different parts of it and start to understand the physics and dynamics of how to hit the ball. There's still some fine-tuning on this exercise, so I have opted not to show that today, but it's going to be really good, actually. So let's look at one of those that is more finished. Is a bungee jump. And some of you might have seen this example because it's available for download, or a version of this available for download at our webpage. And we have done some, or Frida made some modifications to it. She took this, and first of all, she set some, okay, what's the learning objectives that this could relate to? So one of the things you're studying is gravitation effects on falling bodies. You are supposed to learn how to explore different parameters and initial values, how they affect some dynamics of a system. How does stiffness work? What is frequency? What happens with frequency if you increase in mass or jump faster or whatever you do in the jump? So those sorts of questions is what the students are supposed to learn about. And then, of course, that's what Frida tries to address with the example. So let's take a look at it. So this is a model. It looks kind of simple. We have a platform. Those that are or have been in Australia kind of recognize the platform. We have a cord and a jumper. The jumper is 75 kilos, and we have a cord with some specifications. What the student can do here and has instructions to how to do is they can simulate that and open up a bit small, like that. So they simulate this, and they will get some results out from it. The cord is kind of advanced, the model, so it takes a bit to simulate. There we go. So what we're seeing here is the height of the jumper as we're jumping. So we start at 10 meters, and it takes a jump out, and then kind of oscillates up and down. So it gives an idea of how it works. But they can also look at the animation of it. There you go. So we have the jumper here, standing on the. How many here have done a bungee jump? No one? Oh, me neither, actually. I would like to, but I've never done it. So we're taking a jump here. And in this case, the cord, you might see that the cord is like not exactly like a real cord would look like. And that's part of the exercise. It's showing you how different types of models might affect the results, so you start to understand the difference between like reality and a model. So if we look at this, I can trace the path of the jumper, like that. And let's jump again. So now he's, jumping there, and we can follow the path of jumping. We can also see that together with a plot. So if I do like this, it will be a bit small now, but you will see a line showing where we are. So if we want to see the exact value of actually any given thing in the model at any given point in time, we can do that. Okay, so this means that now the student has something to engage in, and that might be kind of fun to play around with. So what could they do then if they have this? Well, let's look at type of questions that you could have, and I'm not going through all of them. There's more questions in the assignments, but there are things like which scenario might put the jumper into risk? So how do you assess that this is a safe thing to do? Localized turning points when the jumper bounces up and towards the platform again. How can you find this? At what time does the jumper hit the water in the three scenarios? So obviously there were three scenarios before them when you try it and hit the water. So those type of questions, some of them that has a specific answer and others that are more about discussion. Getting the concepts and ideas of physics. And if we look at the material then, let's open the teacher instructions. The teacher instructions come with things. First, it gives the teacher what kind of background do you need, which softwares do you need to download, how is the setup, and a lot of details about the model that typically the student won't really see, but it's good for the teacher to have that background knowledge. And then it gives also, let's do this, like that. It gives things like further suggestions. Once you've done this, you can do this or that, and it gives the model assumptions that you had made and so on. So it gives the teacher the background needed in order to be teaching this specific course. Okay, and then they have solutions. I'm not going to go through the solutions too much, but I just want to show in which form they are. So the solutions are not only like a number saying this is the answer. They're telling the idea about how to actually come up with a solution. And it says, for instance, here we can look at, in this section, the student will practice reading and interpreting plots. The student does not have access to all different formulas, as the purpose of the exercise is to only read the plot and learn how to get values from it. So it's a very basic example. While other examples might require more knowledge about equations and so on. So they're in all sorts of levels. And then finally, what they also have, the models you already seen. Then of course you have the student assignments. And the students' assignments have the learning objectives, they have the reading material, and then they give step-by-step instructions on how to do it. So it's okay, load this model, load this package, this is how it looks like, And eventually you will get to your first, give some background and get your first question and so on. So this material, you should be able to take it and just do the exercises without having to any previous knowledge about System Modeler or Mathematica, by the way. It should kind of just work. That's the idea. And remember, the students that did this, they had 3-day crash course before they did the material. So yeah, that's the sort of things that are involved here. So okay, so how do you do that now to answer these questions? So we saw the model, one simulation of it, and one question was how deep or how heavy can a jumper be before he hits the ground? So then what the student can do is he can start to play around with the mass and say, let's have the jumper be 90 kilos. Simulate again and see what happens. And I don't think 90 kilos is enough if I remember correctly. But anyways, he will get closer. So he jumps down here. Oh, sorry, you can't even see him. And didn't hit the ground. But still, you can start to play around, change values until you found exactly the value needed to hit the water. And then, of course, the student needs to kind of explain why that happens and so on. But you can also take it to the next level. So suppose that you would like to invent a new version of Bungee Jump where you don't only have one jumper and don't only have one cord, you have two jumpers and two cords, or as many as you want. Then you can prepare the model so you can do things like this. Change component type. And here we have another type of bungee cord, which is called multi-jump. Let's pull that here. And the graphics changes. It says now that we have two jumpers. So let's look at that. What will happen if two people were jumping at the same time? And not in parallel. They are like so there we go. And of course, if they want to add a third jumper or whatever, they can do that. And now that's we think is the time where they start to really engage and play around. Okay, what's happening here? What's doing here? And that's kind of the idea with all this material. And with that, I'll leave my part, and Patrik will continue with population dynamics. I think it's the first one.
Right. So as John mentioned, I'll go a few more of these applications areas where we asked the summer interns where they felt like models would really enhance certain concepts. And I'd like to start out with the work done by Anna Palmer. So we asked her when she started out, is there any courses that she had taken while in high school where she felt like she wanted to have a model that she could play around with and really understand what is happening behind the scenes? And one of the first things that she came up with was population dynamics. Now, what is population dynamics and population genetics, you might ask? Well, in a broad sense, you could say it's used to explain all the life around it. It's used to explain why, for example, this tree here has green leaves, or why giraffes have long necks, or why birds can fly, but that's a bit fluffy. So I'll break it down a bit. Population genetics concerns how genes, that is, which defines your different types of traits, how they seem to change in populations over generations, why some traits seem to grow more common as time goes by, and while other traits die out. It's also used to explain, for example, why the species we see around us today look very much different from how we believe that their ancestors looked a long time ago. So that's kind of the fundamental concepts of that. And it's also used, for example, to explain why I have brown eyes, or why Jan here has blue eyes. And the way we kind of usually teach this is by first we're looking at individual inheritance. We're explaining how your parents give down their genes, their traits, down to you, their offspring. And we're also explaining it by looking at the world, how it looks today. We're looking at, saying that the giraffes, for example, they have long necks because they are fit in an environment where the trees are long so they can reach the food up there. But one thing that Anna felt that she didn't quite get a grasp of by using this, when she was taught these concepts, was how things change over time. Because by just looking at today, we're not explaining all the small gradual changes in traits that led us to where we are today, where life is today. And by extension, where she didn't get a grasp of how things would change for tomorrow. And in a world where the environment, it's constantly changing, these questions are more important now for the students than ever to understand. And also she felt that by just understanding how her parents passed down their traits down to her, just on an individual level, she didn't get the whole concept of what's actually happening in real life with whole populations that mix together and form complex dynamics. And what she felt was that if she could have a model where she could tune these different things, where she could track how the traits changed during generations, then she would understand that better. So what she went ahead and did was she created a whole modeling library where she could set up population groups and understand how the traits of those population groups changed over time. And remember, as John mentioned, she did this with only a 3-day crash course in System Modeler, so this is pretty impressive. This is a very simple model that's developed using her library, and I'll zoom in a bit so you can see it better. Oh, that's maybe a bit too much. So here we have 4 different population groups. That's what kind of this describes. And 2 of them have one set of genes, that we call it trait A here, and the other ones, they have another set of genes, we call it trait B. And in those population groups, they can either be young enough to not be, they're not mature enough yet to reproduce, so they're not affecting how many new organisms are born into each of the groups. But from here, they have 2 different alternatives. Some which are not adapted to the environment and might die before they are mature enough for reproduction, while others of the species might end up here, and here, where they are here, they will affect the number of newborns which are added to their population groups. So it's kind of a feedback loop of sorts that's happening here. So we can kind of look at how, now that we have a model here, we can take a few of the parameters from this model, tweak them around a bit to understand what is happening in populations. So since we've done this, we can open up we can run a simulation from the Wolfram language, which I think will open up right now, hopefully. Yeah, there we go. It's just loading it in. So here we have a trace of the populations over time. Right now, we are able to tweak a few parameters here. We can change which ones, how the trait distributions look at the beginning of time, and we can change how many of a certain trait survive until reproduction. So we can see that with just a small change, one of the populations will go down if they are not suited for the environment. And this might seem like a very simple model, and it is, but still, just this one can be used to explain a lot of the things that's happening around us in real life. And let me give you a more concrete example of this, what we can explain with this model. And that is the case of the peppered moths. Now, in pre-industrial England, a lot of the moths looked like this. They were white with some black spots. And the reason why they looked like this was because that allowed them to hide on the lichen-covered tree trunks. And they were kind of camouflaged against the environment. And predatory birds, for example, they had a hard time spotting them. That meant that more of the moths that looked like this would survive until reproduction than the moths that look like this, because there were a few moths that had those that were completely black like this, but they were easily picked off by predatory birds. Now, and then the population, let's see, just adjust this one up a bit. Let's see if my computer wants to play along. Yeah, so the population of the black moths went down pretty quickly. Now, something happened during the Industrial Revolution. All the coal that was spewing out from the industries, they killed off the lichen on the trees, and it blackened the tree trunks. And maybe you can imagine what happened then. Well, of course, it was much easier for the black moths to hide against the tree trunks, so that one disappeared. Anyway, so they were more fit to the environment, and the graphs kind of look like this. Now, after just a few years, after just a few generations, even though they were very, very uncommon before the Industrial Revolution, sometime after, the black moths were actually the most common species. So that is one of the things that we can use to describe with this model. And let me give you, actually I think I have time for another example. And that is the case of malaria and sickle cell anemia. And this is something, John showed the assignment sheet previously. So this is something that I've almost straight off lifted from one of the assignments that Anna has created. And it aims to explain malaria and sickle cell anemia. And what is there to explain, you might ask? Well, malaria and sickle cell anemia, they are two completely different diseases. One of them is a sickle cell anemia, it's a genetic disease that's brought down from parents to offspring, while malaria is a disease that comes from parasites that's transmitted from mosquitoes. And yet, even though these are completely different, I should say that what happens with sickle cell anemia is that your red blood cells that normally look like this, they start to form sickle shapes like this, which is really bad. Now, anyway, what happens in sickle cell anemia and malaria is that they are present in the same areas. And why would that be? And also, and why would that be? Well, to understand this, we can use one of the models that she had created. It's just a bit bigger than the previous one. And here we introduced a concept in genetic, which is a genetic carrier. Now, you might know that you have one set of genes from your mom and one set of genes from your dad. And in some cases, these are identical. In some cases, they differ, and that gives you different types of traits. And if you have one healthy gene for sickle cell anemia and one that actually gives you sickle cell anemia, then you're still healthy. You need to get one of those genes from your dad and one of those genes from your mom. And that's when you actually develop sickle cell anemia. So here she has introduced another population group. The first one here are the healthy ones. They have two healthy genes against sickle cell anemia. Here they have one healthy and one sick gene, and here they have two sick genes. And sadly, as you can see here, we can almost assume that those two actually develop sickle cell anemia. They don't survive until reproduction. Now, one might imagine that these, from the previous example, you might imagine that this gene would die off. It doesn't infer any benefit. Well, actually, it does. Surprisingly, it does. In malaria-affected areas, being a carrier, remember that doesn't, if you're only a carrier for sickle cell anemia, that doesn't make you sick. It actually infers a benefit. It infers a protection against malaria. So what we can do with this model is we can simulate this. And we can see what happens. So if I bring this one up, and it just needs to load it in a bit. Okay. And once again, she has given us a few parameters to tweak with. There's a lot of parameters in this model, and you can just bring out exactly the ones that will explain the right concepts to your students. Now, what we can see here is in an environment where we can say that if there is malaria in this environment or not. In an environment where malaria is not common, then as we expect, the number of carriers would decline and the number of non-carriers would go up. But we can simulate this in a malaria endemic country. I think if I press the right button, then we'll see that the number of carriers go up because it infers a protection against malaria. So these are kind of the intuitions that we can make the students get by playing along with this themselves, and we don't have to say it beforehand that this is what they are supposed to understand. They will get that intuition by exploring these models. So I kind of want to show how this can look as we give it to a student. It looks kind of the things that John gave you, that John showed you, but a bit different. Here we have the thing that we give to the students. It contains the reading material, yada, 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 as a system description. And then everything that they are supposed to do is done inside of the notebook. They get everything here preloaded. Don't have to understand any Wolfram language code if it isn't a topic. They don't have to understand how to build these models in System Modeler. We could just give them an assignment notebook and say, here, play with this, and then, of course, answer the questions after each section. So that's kind of how it can look. And we're making these more simplified notebooks sometimes when we're targeting high school students, so that they can just jump right into it. We don't have to assume that they know anything really other than the topic area. So that was kind of a virtual lab of sorts. When I think of laboratory exercises, I come from a different kind of area. I come from a biochemical engineering area. So when I think of laboratory exercises, I think of strapping on your lab coat and the rubber gloves and the pipette in hand and ready to explore the universe. So these are those physical labs and this virtual lab that we had set up. It's a bit different, but in reality, they are a lot similar in the goals that they are trying to achieve. They both are trying to give you theoretical knowledge by giving you practical things to do, by engaging you and letting you play around for yourself. Now, we also thought about could we bring such a real life lab, so those that I'm familiar with, could we bring that into a virtual lab environment? And maybe more importantly, is there any reason why we would want to do that? And to give you kind of some motivation for this, let me tell you a story about when I was an undergraduate student. We were doing a laboratory exercise. We were supposed to understand if a bacteria, I can't remember exactly, but we were supposed to understand if we had a certain bacteria in a sample or another type. So what we did was we placed it into these small sample pipes, and we put it in a centrifuge. It went round, round, round. The bacteria fell to the bottom, and it kind of looked like this. The bacteria ends up in the bottom in something that's called a pellet, and then everything around it ends up in the fluid above it that's called a supernatant. Now, these are often excruciatingly long exercises, and you get a stack of paper called a lab manual that details exactly what you're supposed to do. So we had gone ahead there, run 6 hours or so before we got this sample. And then I knew from the lab manual that you were supposed to have the bacteria for the next step, so I threw away the supernatant, the fluid thing on the top. And oh no, because something that they tell you when you're starting out with, for example, chemistry, biochemistry, or even cooking, is that you should read the recipe beforehand. You should read the lab manual completely beforehand. And of course, it turns out that there on page 12 or whatever, it said that you needed the supernatant for another step, which is quite bad because, it wasn't down in the drain. So safe from trying to salvage it from the drain trap, it was just nowhere to be found anymore. And that meant, of course, that all the 6 hours I spent before this, preparing this, were wasted. Or were they wasted? Because I don't think they were, because I learned something important there. And it wasn't that you should read the recipe, because I still don't do that, which is might be why I'm working with computers rather than in a laboratory. Anyway, I learned why I needed the supernatant for the next step, because failing at something made me much more interested in why we did it. I read up that, it doesn't really matter, but we needed it for the next step, and I understood why. And I probably wouldn't have done that if I just followed along in a laboratory manual, doing step by step. I don't remember the other steps today, for example. But of course, it also meant that I couldn't complete the rest of the 2-hour lab because I didn't have the material. And one thing in chemistry and biochemistry is that material is really expensive. So even if I could redo everything, which we probably didn't have time to, we were limited by the material cost. So it would be nice if I could, be allowed to make the mistakes that I did, be allowed to actually try different things outside of the recipe, understanding why those instructions are there in the first place. And it would be nice if I could have, before I actually went out and did that physical laboratory exercise, if I could be able to run it in a simulation and be able to make those mistakes. So, and I kind of glossed over him in the beginning. I'm sorry, Emil. But Emil, one of our summer interns, he thought along the same paths. So he thought, well, what if we could create a chemical or a biochemical or any type of laboratory exercise in a virtual environment? How would that look? So he went ahead and created some for the separation of hemoglobin. And now I'm getting kind of a crossover between the previous ones unintentionally, but hemoglobin is the thing in your cells in your red blood cells that binds to oxygen and distributes it to the rest of the body. And sometimes we want to take a sample of blood, we want to extract the red blood cells and extract the hemoglobin from that and just have a pure sample of that. And why would we want to do that? Well, one of the reasons actually is because it's an important diagnostics tool for sickle cell anemia. So this is purely unintentional, but if you take the pure sample of hemoglobin, you can see if someone has sickle cell anemia. And one of the other nice things about this process is that it involves a lot of steps, which I like because then there's a lot of ways to make mistakes to learn from. So I kind of want to show what he did, and this time I'm not showing the model that's running. We have a model here that describes everything that's happening in the lab, but I don't want to show that here because that's not the topic, and this is something that we probably won't show to the students either. It's just a vessel, it's just something for them to interact with. They don't have to understand what's happening behind the scenes. Right, anyway, so what this kind of could look like is we can start the simulation behind the scenes, hopefully. Yeah, and then we have a couple of different steps that Emil, he took a lab manual, he lifted the steps right out of them, and he made it something, he made a simulation model for it, and he made interfaces for the students to interact with. So the first part of separating this hemoglobin from the blood is to centrifuge the samples. So he made a virtual centrifuge that the students can interact with. And there's a couple of settings for the centrifuge here. We're just saying that how number of Gs we should give it. And then what it would kind of look like in a lab, you would be able to set those settings. You would be able to start the centrifuge. The lab manual would tell you to wait 5 or so minutes, and then you would collect your samples. Now, since this is a simulation model, we can actually provide the students with a bit more than that. We can provide them with an insight. If we want to, we can provide them with an inside look of what is happening within the vessel. So here we can see a trace with some different concentrations. And here we're seeing the red blood cells getting removed from the supernatant. Sorry for technical jargon, but it's forming inside in a pellet in the bottom of the vessel, and we can stop the centrifuge, and we can see that then the concentration stays the same in the kind of fluid part. We can also allow them to make mistakes, such as the lab protocol will tell them to you shouldn't centrifuge these harder than 500 Gs. But what will happen if we do that anyway? We can allow them to make mistakes. Well, as we'll see here, the red broke, I think. Yeah, the broken red blood cells will start to increase because we're actually breaking the cells. And then we can stop the centrifuge, and we can move on to the next step. And the next step, it will be running on the same state as they left the other state, that they left the other step. So if they made mistakes there, it will follow them along. So then there's some more, interfaces for them to interact with, and they could even jump ahead a step and see what happens. Okay, I don't want to wait for this centrifuge. I just want to get on with my day. What would happen then? And of course, we can allow them to restart from anywhere. So here we could allow them to restart from the beginning. They made a mistake. We can give them unlimited material because it's just a simulation. We can give them unlimited time with the laboratory equipment, which is kind of neat because these usually range in the price tag of $10,000 to $100,000. It's pretty neat to give each student one of their own. And of course, then I'm not going to go through all of these steps, but then they would go through, and it will tell you them what they're doing in each step, what to learn from the steps, what kind of mistakes they are allowed to make this time around. So that's two other applications areas where we could use system models to explain different concepts. Right, I think that was all I had for this. We're giving a few more talks this conference. This was the first of the talks we're giving on Wolfram System Modeler in different applications areas in different ways. Tomorrow, John will be giving a talk of what's new in System Modeler 5. We released a new version, a major version now this summer that comes with some exciting new things, among other things, stuff that we're using in these educational scenarios. Also tomorrow I'll give a talk on how we're trying to further integrate System Modeler inside the Wolfram language, how we can think of a model of a system, for example, this laboratory exercise, the Bungee Jump, how we can think of that as a symbol within the Wolfram language that you can interact with in any way you want. Right. On Friday, John will be giving a presentation that's kind of like this one, but looking at System Modeler from an industry perspective, how we can use System Modeler to design different applications before you actually, for example, build them. And if you want a sneak peek of what's happening there, you can come down to our hardware lab in the basement, where we are displaying how we built a model in System Modeler of something that we then went ahead and built in real life, and what kind of understanding we could get from that model before we went ahead and built the real thing. So with that, I think I will end this presentation if John doesn't have anything to add. Oh yeah, sorry. Okay, yeah, I thought. So, with that, are there any questions for me and for John? No questions? Well, if you think of anything, or if you're actually, I should say that since we've developed these courseware and we're looking to distribute them to universities that are interested in using them for education, we would love to get in touch with anyone that would be interested in actually using these models in their classroom. So just grab a hold of us after this presentation if you're interested in that, or if there are any further questions that you didn't dare to speak up right now. I see you're all terrified. Yeah, so with that, I thank you for listening.